planned to go on a massive strike over a labor dispute, and this is during the Korean War. Worried that a steel shortage would hurt weapons production during the war, at the 11th hour, Truman directed Secretary of Commerce Sawyer to temporarily seize the steel mills in order to prevent a strike and continue production of steel. The steel companies sought an injunction, and the Supreme Court decided 6-3 in favor of the steel companies. We believe this case was wrongly decided, and the seizure should have been allowed. And one note really quickly, during the construction of the Taft-Hartley Act a few years before this, Congress considered and ultimately rejected, including an amendment that would explicitly authorize the seizures, but they also did not explicitly prohibit such seizures. And the Constitution itself makes no mention of the power of seizure under its description of the executive branch.
Okay. On what grounds did the Supreme Court decide the case? Like, are you talking Constitution? Like, are you going to argue at all from the basis of constitutionality? Because, like, what did, like?
Okay, I mean, basically, the powers of the executive are very broadly defined. So, like, Congress basically said, in this, like, very wishy-washy situation, we think that you shouldn't have done this, but, like, it can be argued either way, and there's no specific constitutional spec knowledge you need to have in arguing this case.
Okay. And so the Supreme Court voted 6-3 in favor of the steel workers, saying that they could go on strike.
Saying that,
No,
in retrospect, that you should not have seized them.
Oh, wait.
Which it says in favor of the steel workers. So the steel workers then did go on strike during the Korean War.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Later, yeah.
Yeah,
they did.
Any other questions?
So we're defending seizing the plant.
No, we're defending not seizing the plant, right?
No. Okay, we're saying the Supreme Court was wrong when they said that he should not have seized the plants. So you're going to say they were right to say that he should not have seized the plants.
Right. Okay.
If you understand.
I think, well, but like, then the question is, was this decided in such a way that, like, then the strike happened? Like, was this decided very quickly, or was this just looking back in hindsight, like, oh, this was?
I mean, it wasn't decided the next day. The Supreme Court doesn't work that fast.
Right.
But it was decided relatively. They went on strike, and we were still in Korea.
Okay, that's what matters.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, we're good?
Yeah.
Okay, so first point. This is the fact that the seizure was necessary for national security. And my first subpoint under this is that extraordinary times call for extraordinary actions. Security will be compromised if there is a strike. That isn't really in doubt. We already had trouble meeting steel production anyway, and this drop in production is going to be disastrous because of the amount of steel that is necessary for weapons production, for ammunition production, for general infrastructure production, not to mention all the steel that's needed in society overall. Moreover, without the steel for weaponry and ammunition, this is going to put U.S. soldiers at risk. Moreover, the stakes are high. This is the beginning of the Cold War. This is the beginning of the standoff with China. There's a lot going on geopolitically, and it's going to be a really disastrous time for us to not be succeeding in Korea, not only for our national defense, but for our broader foreign policy aims. Further under this point, it's unreasonable to think that the Constitution can't adapt to wartime needs. It was purposely made to be flexible for times of crisis such as this that could not be foreseen before. One moment and I'll thank you. The Constitution is intended to endure for a long time and consequently to be adapted to various crises in human affairs. And it's kind of folly to uphold the letter of the law at the expense of the state itself. It kind of makes the Constitution a suicide pact. The whole point is that it's flexible for these times. That was clearly not the framers' intent on that point.
Right, just to understand the framers' intent, they give special powers to the president during times of war, correct?
He's the commander-in-chief. And the second subpoint under this first point is that there is precedent for taking extraordinary measures during wartime. An example of this would be Washington. During the Whiskey Rebellion, he mobilized the militia against people who were technically U.S. citizens. You're not really supposed to do that, but he had to protect the fragility, this like a particularly fragile union at this time. So like this isn't even the most drastic thing that's been done at an extraordinary time. The second point, this is consistent with the president's role. This has already been alluded to. The first subpoint here is that the president is the steward of the nation. Not only is he the sole organ and has sole responsibility for foreign policy and for conduct of military endeavors, he's the commander-in-chief of the army, and if he's not going to be the one who's going to take this measure to support the war, then nobody's going to be able to do it. Moreover, protecting the nation is paramount in his role. To that end, he should take whatever necessary action he has to. Particularly when it's not actually forbidden by the Constitution, as these seizures are not. Second subpoint here is that the president is the executor of laws passed by Congress. This is really crucial. Congress had directed the president to build up the nation's defenses during this time of military action. Moreover, they had supported the action in Korea by continuing to finance the war. So Congress has already explicitly empowered the president to carry this out and to be the commander-in-chief in this particular circumstance. So he And because the steel shortage would prevent the president from carrying out these orders, he clearly is compelled to do this. Moreover, under this subpoint, Congress had given the president the power to allocate and fix prices for scarce goods during this time, which steel certainly was a scarce good, as I've already said. A significant steel shortage, combined with the fact that this is a period of increasing purchasing power, is going to lead to a general rise in prices across the board because steel is such a broadly used commodity, and this is going to lead to inflation. So basically, to enforce Congress's law, the president had to act. Otherwise, he's going to be actually violating something that Congress told him to do. The third subpoint under this is about the legality of eminent domain. And this is sort of covered by the Fifth Amendment that says your property can't be just taken from you without some sort of process. However, the Fifth Amendment doesn't make any claim as to which branch of the government can do the seizing. So the president isn't prohibited from doing this. Traditionally, Congress does, but it's not explicitly said, it's just kind of a tradition. And this clearly falls under public use, as it will provide for national security. So this clearly falls under a reasonable use of eminent domain. And finally, I want to get on to my third point, and this is why we can't actually leave this to Congress. The first point here is that Congress is an extremely slow, deliberative body, and this is great for a lot of things, but for this in particular, it's really bad. We need to respond very fast in this emergency, and the executive has the flexibility to respond to this emergency when he needs to. Moreover, he has the duty to do what he has to do. It will preserve the peace until Congress can act. So in a way, this is kind of maintaining the status quo until Congress can actually do something. They're not going to be able to do something at the 11th hour when the steel companies are about to just shut down on that point.
One of the clarification questions. Is this affecting just a few steel plants or all the steel plants in the country?
It's the entire union of steel workers, and all steel workers are in this union. It's a very small union, so it's all the steel. Okay. Moreover, the labor negotiations before this went on for 6 months before the strike. So there's really no reason to think that this strike is going to be over in a couple of days. This is going to be a significant long-term harm, both to the economy in general, to the military action in Korea, and to the fact that the president is going to be able to fulfill the role that he has to, both in upholding the law Congress has told him to uphold in terms of price stabilization and in terms of his responsibility as the commander-in-chief in a military action in Korea. The second subpoint under this is that Congress did not react when Truman informed them the day after he seized the steel plants that he had done so. They could have actually reacted as opposed to saying, hey, I guess you did that. So like the fact that he didn't do that when he laid out his reasons is kind of a tacit approval for this. So basically for all of these reasons, the fact that this was extremely crucial and is broadly recognized as crucial for national security, the fact that it's consistent with the president's role as it's defined very broadly, and the fact that we can't leave it to Congress because they're not going to actually get it done, and this is a military and economic situation, means that we are proud to propose.
You're here.
This is 16.4.
Thanks to Prime Minister for his remarks. I call upon the Leader of Opposition to go through the constructive speech for the opposition side of the speech not to exceed 8 minutes.
Yep. Thanks so much, Mr. Speaker. Guys, for running an interesting case. And to America out there. All right, 3 independent points. First and most important thing I want to talk about is the balance of powers. And here's the thing. I rise on a POI and I say, isn't it true that the Constitution grants special powers to the executive during times of war? And they say yes. Why does that matter? Because we haven't declared war since World War II. What does that mean? In Korea, we didn't declare war. Why is the Constitution set up like this, though? Because they think that the executive should only be given special powers not delegated to him by the Constitution when the Congress has decided that it's appropriate to commit U.S. troops abroad. Now, we're time-spaced, so we haven't had the War Powers Act yet, so there's no sense of whether or not Congress has the ability to rein in the executive when it comes to just deploying troops abroad. But certainly Congress is the one that gets to decide whether or not the executive gets to exercise special powers. And the nature of war, though, is that it's kind of a blank check for special powers, but a really high standard must be met to say that we want to give the executive that blank check. The threat to our national security must be so exigent as to say that domestic rights can be violated by the executive. Because all of their justifications for why these violations were necessary stem from the executive's role as head of state and head of government, which is what the executive is. but that means that they stem from the executive's role as a foreign policy actor, but that are retroactively applying that to domestic rights violations, saying that we're going to subvert the democratic and free decision of a workers' union to go on strike during a time of war and limit their rights. The Constitution explicitly does not grant the president any powers to go in. And unfortunately, guys, the nature of limited government, which is the principle that governs our Constitution, says that powers not explicitly delegated are not granted. So you can't say, oh, Congress tacitly consented, or the Constitution doesn't prohibit the president from doing this. The Constitution doesn't prohibit the president from doing a lot of things. The Constitution doesn't prohibit the president from walking into this room, bending me over the table and spanking me like a good little schoolboy. It's still probably not within the president's authority to do so. I mean, granted, that's also assault. But guess what? No, but here's the thing, though. It's also illegal under regular federal law to interfere with the free organization of a group of workers unions. So I think it's the same kind of principle, that the only time when the executive can violate laws or the Constitution is when Congress has declared war. That's what the framers intended, and if they wanted to change it in this particular instance, they needed to amend the Constitution to do so, or the president needed to ask for Congress's explicit approval. Sure.
Okay, most federal discrimination laws are based in the Commerce Clause. Can you explain what in the Commerce Clause, which says Congress can regulate commerce, gives Congress any explicit power to regulate federal discrimination?
Okay, this is the thing. It gives a general category of which discrimination laws are a factor. So, for instance, it's necessary in the conduct of interstate commerce to hire employees and to pay them and to determine who you hire. So that's within their broad power. Here's the thing. It says the executive is granted special war powers, which is where you drew the basis of your PMC in times of war. It says Congress is the only body that can declare war. I think that's a case of where it's very explicit where the general power stems from, and that in this case the general power wasn't activated. Congress always has the ability to regulate commerce, which means they always have the ability to pass discrimination laws. I think that's a clear standard. But what does it mean if you start violating this standard? We think it sets a horrible precedent for presidents coming in and spanking guys like me in the middle of debate rounds. Or, more specifically, and less offensively or humorously, we think that it sets a really bad precedent for what presidents are actually able to do. In fact, all members of the executive branch can send troops abroad and then justify all kinds of domestic rights violations in the name of sending those troops abroad. We realize that the U.S. is likely to be engaged in many more conflicts in the future. We recognize that now we're in the Cold War. We have a policy of containment. We want to actively, militarily engage communism wherever we find it. What does that mean? We need to not set a precedent of whenever the U.S. is putting troops abroad without Congress's approval, the executive can run amok back home. We think it's fine that the executive have the power to do it. We think it's good and necessary. But if we want to have a system of letting the executive violate rights, then we at least need to pass some system, some new set of laws that decides exactly how that's going to happen. So I think it's unconstitutional, and even if for some reason it were quasi-constitutional, it would set a horrible precedent. Basically, rejecting what the president did here sends a message to Congress that you need to take up this act legislatively, you need to take this issue up legislatively in order to prevent serious issues like this in the future. The second point I want to make is just that this wasn't necessary. So they say, oh my God, all of the steel mills. First of all, it's not all of the steel mills. We actually don't, we think it was the Steelworkers Union, but factually Anish is the one who knows the history here better than I do. A lot of these mills still remain open, so we still have access to steel. But more importantly, the effort in North Korea included a number of our allies. What does that mean? This is after the Marshall Plan has been enacted and Europe's industrial capability has been, to a large extent, greatly rehabilitated. So we have allies that are engaged in this fight with us. We can now trade with them and get steel from them, and it's absolutely necessary. Guess what? They're probably going to provide it cheaply for us because we're the ones providing the majority of the troops for this war effort. The point where their interests are in line with ours. We don't think that the price of steel is a major issue. What does that mean, though? It means that their entire rationale for why we need this isn't met. So even if the president had some capacity to, in not times of war, use exigency to violate the domestic rights of citizens, we don't think this meets any kind of exigent standard, so they fail on that ground too. The third independent point I want to talk about is the notion of workers' rights. And we would say is that coming out of the 1930s, the 40s, the Great Depression, where we saw a major reform in the rights of workers, it's absolutely important to maintain that workers have the right to unionize and to collectively bargain. Why is that important? Because we recognize that the United States is still a very stratified society, that they haven't achieved a lot of fundamental equality between workers and the elites, and that the working class, the proletariat, if you will, still to a large extent has a lot of difficulty putting food on their families' table, providing for their families, providing for a meaningful life. We think at that point then that they're the people in the United States who deserve the most protection, the people who first and foremost need the ability to unionize, to say, we're going to get together to make sure that we have our fair share of the pie. And if they chose to democratically exercise that right in this instance, taking into account what it would mean in terms of bad publicity for them, we think we absolutely need to respect their right to do so. Otherwise, it intimidates other workers from exercising their rights in other instances. Maybe it's not a foreign policy crisis in the future. Maybe it's a domestic crisis. We think it sets a bad precedent, and we also think that workers aren't going to unionize if there's a chance that the plant will be seized, because that or not unionize, but not strike, because that totally defeats the purpose of the strike, because it undermines their effort and they lose money because of it. We think at that point it's very clear that you're sending a terrible message to workers, and ultimately that they're not going to be able to successfully stand up for their rights in their future, and even if they were hypothetically able to, they're not going to take the step. Let's go case study. The first thing we hear from them is that the seizure was necessary for national security. Well, their syllogism here is as follows. Steel is necessary for the war. The war was going on and is an issue of national security. Therefore, seizing the steel plants was necessary. That syllogism fails in two instances, though. First, I've told you that there were other sources of steel. But second, I don't think they've demonstrated that the Korean War was so crucial to national security. We had the end of a peninsula potentially being, under threat from a communist government, where we actually already have a large number of troops over there and are pretty confident in our ability via Douglas MacArthur to win this war. But most importantly, if we lose the peninsula, it's a peninsula surrounded by sea. Where else is communism going to go from North Korea at that point? We don't think there is a strong Soviet link to the North Koreans at this point, so we don't think that the Soviet Union is going to feel particularly emboldened by this. And China, we haven't beaten them back all the way to the Chinese border, I don't think, at this point yet. So China has no particular link to this. What's the national security threat, guys? Then they talk about how this is consistent with the president's role. And they say the president conducts foreign policy, and it's not forbidden by the Constitution. Covered both of these things. The president conducts foreign policy. He doesn't limit domestic rights unless he's explicitly authorized by Congress. That is in the Constitution. Then they say that Congress said build up the military. Well, Congress said build up the military, but Congress didn't say build up the military by violating the freedom of assembly of workers' unions. Then they say eminent domain. Really, guys, the president is the one who exercises eminent domain. You want to make that argument? It's local governments that do it, and they clearly do it when the property is useless, not when it's chosen to be abdicated in the name of standing up for your economic rights. Finally, they say that Congress is bad for considering these issues. In this one instance, Congress may not be ideal, but Congress absolutely needs to be the one responsible for setting the standards in the future. We beg to oppose. 8:35.
Thank the Leader of Opposition. Now call upon the Member of Government to deliver the next constructive testimony in opposition of 8 minutes. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker, everybody for coming out here. I think this is a really interesting case, and I'm so grateful to Side Op for just throwing themselves wholeheartedly into it. So I think they brought up three really interesting opposition points, and the first one is the most important, obviously, the balance of powers. So they talk a lot about how the Constitution grants special powers to the president only during times of war, and he harps on this point pretty much throughout the entire thing. And then he talks about how we haven't declared war. But what we'd say is that while that's technically true, in this particular case it would be redundant, because recognize that Congress has in fact continued to fund the war. Congress has directed the president to build up our defenses. Congress has continued to have an okay for the president to continue to send troops over to Korea. So what we'd say is at this point, for Congress to say, oh, by the way, there's a war on, there's really no point. We don't think that there's actually a need for the Congress to explicitly authorize the president to do certain things when it's already known. There's nothing in the Article 2 that says Article 2 changes when there's a war. Nowhere in Article 2. It's sort of assumed, because in general we like the balance of powers. But what did we say what did Dana say when she got up here? The Constitution is not actually supposed to be a suicide pact. We're not supposed to point to the Constitution and say, look, the letter of the law trumps everything else. And what we'd say here is that the spirit of the law, that the president is meant to come in and defend his people, defend his country, defend our boys in blue over on the other side of the world, that does in fact trump trying to peer through Article 2 and find something that one can argue on either side is or is not there. And no matter what they say about limited government theory, it's a theory. This is not something that everybody agrees on. It's not actually a fact. As I up when I brought up the issue of discrimination. And I'm actually going to jump down and address that now and then move back up. Sorry about your flow. So they talk about how discrimination affects commerce, which means that in all cases, powers not explicitly delegated to a branch of the government are restricted. First of all, we told you that limited government is not the only theory out there, and what we propose is that, especially during times when national security is threatened, we think that stewardship theory, where we say that the president, in his capacity as commander-in-chief, as defender of our country, should be able to do things that we think are implied by Article 2, just as we think that Congress can do things that are implied by Article 1. Recognize that just as discrimination affects commerce, the ability to produce steel in quantities needed in order to continue the war is important, is necessary for the president to be able to carry out his explicitly granted duties as commander-in-chief, et cetera, et cetera. Sure.
But under the standard you're advocating, the president could always just take the country to war and then be delegated these powers. If that's the case, why does the Constitution have a provision saying only Congress can declare war?
Because what we said was, like, the reason that we don't think that this is a problem, and the reason why we think this is only applicable in this particular case, is because we do think that the tacit approval of Congress does make a difference. We think that since Congress did approve sending troops abroad and has continued to fund those troops abroad, we do think that this doesn't mean that the president can say, hey, I'm sending troops to the Maldives tomorrow, and by the way, you no longer have freedom of speech because it would violate national security. We think that Congress clearly would do something about that, and because they didn't do anything about it here, we think that this tacit approval is very important. They also say that there's a very high burden for a blank check. We don't think that allowing a president to maintain the status quo until Congress has time to deliberate and act constitutes a blank check. We think it's necessary for the security of the country. Second, he talks about how it's not necessary. And then they say, well, not all the steel mills closed down. Recognize that when you're talking about United Steelworkers, we have enough steel workers striking to make a very large dent in the steel production. Second, he says that our allies are rehabilitated. A few years after the start of the Marshall Plan, I don't really think they're rehabilitated enough to be sending a whole lot of steel overseas when they're still trying to pull themselves back together. Recognize that Britain wasn't really rehabilitated until the 1970s. We don't think that this is really the case. Furthermore, they could recognize that this is the time when the U.S. has been booming a whole lot. All sorts of steel has been needed for just about anything. We could barely meet our own steel supply needs before the war, much less when you're taking into account trying to produce all the weaponry for all of our wars. Third, they talk about the rights of unions and how we need to protect the right to bargain. And we'd say that this is true, but we believe on our side of the house, and we think this is borne out by other union and bargaining laws, that there should be restrictions, and that certain groups of workers for whom striking would actually harm a significant group of people should not be permitted to strike, except possibly under certain circumstances. No, thank you. Furthermore, we'd say that, like, in addition to our boys in blue, who are going to be hurt by this, recognize that this sends the price of all consumer goods up. Because steel at this point is used to produce lots and lots of things. And when steel prices go up, that means other consumer prices go up, and you have the problem of inflation. And that's going to screw with the workers' raise, back in the US, the workers' raise that they're trying to get, which means that you're not actually going to get a significant benefit to these workers, no matter how much we'd like to think. No, thank you. Now I'm going to go back case-side, because I really think there was a lot of important stuff case-side, and it deserved a lot more than the 1 minute that the LO had, well, I guess a minute and a half that he gave it. Now, we talk about how the seizure was necessary for national security. He mentions that there were other sources of steel, please cross upon my earlier analysis, and then he talks about how Korea is not all that crucial to national security. I promised Jenny I would say this. We're in a war. Man, I believe, was the actual phrase, but recognize that this is the beginning of the Cold War. And no matter what he says about how Korea is a fairly isolated peninsula, the domino theory does not actually require geography for it to hold true. What we're finding right now is that in order to prevent countries from going communist, from seeing other countries going communist and deciding to follow along, we do actually need to nip it in the bud. And when we do believe that, like, Red China, the Soviet Union, is trying to branch out and extend its influence abroad, yes, every little bit helps. And yes, we do think that this is a matter of national security to us, as well as, furthermore, the safety of our soldiers, which we think also falls under the president's roles and responsibilities, is protecting the people that he has sent overseas. Furthermore, recognize that we said that the Constitution should be able to adapt to wartime needs. As I said, there's nothing in Article 2 that says, here's when Article 2 changes in wartime. We think that a lot of this is something that we've interpreted over the years, as we've looked at it and said, yes, maybe there should be some different things that happen in wartime. And once you agree that that's the case, then we think you pretty much have to concede that this being necessary to continue our fight in Korea, our fight against communism, etc., and to protect our soldiers, that really does fall under the category of when we should make these changes. Then we said that this is really consistent with the president's role, and we gave you several reasons why. He's steward of the nation, he is executor of laws, and the legality of eminent domain. Sure.
But we specifically said that the president only has that authority with regards to foreign policy, but that doesn't then cross apply in terms of his ability to regulate.
Right, exactly. And this is what goes back to my POI that I raised, is just because Congress only has the power to regulate commerce, he said himself that when you've got something like discrimination that directly affects their ability to regulate commerce and affects interstate commerce itself, then we do believe that Congress's ability to regulate something extends to discrimination at the federal level. And we'd say that the same thing happens here. When something that's happening inside the United States directly affects the president's ability to conduct his foreign policy role and his commander-in-chief role abroad, then we say that his powers, especially in these very extraordinary circumstances, should extend to something happening within the United States. He talks about how the president can't limit rights unless authorized by the Constitution. Again, we'd say that Congress's tacit approval is enough for this. We talk about how he's the executor of laws and how he's executing Congress's direct demand to build up reserves and fund Korea. And they say, well, they didn't direct him to do it through build up through a seizure. Recognize that the Congress never actually authorizes the president to take a specific mode of doing something. They say that you need to carry out this law, and the president is meant to, I believe this is almost a direct quote, take whatever means are necessary and proper to carry out that law. And what we'd say is, for all the reasons we've shown you, this is necessary and this is proper. He laughs at the idea of the legality of eminent domain, saying, well, local governments do it. Says who, Mr. Speaker? The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process and compensation. Never says by who. Certainly doesn't say local government. Certainly doesn't say Congress. No, thank you. So what we say is that once we know that, like, there is, the Constitution doesn't specifically lay out one particular person to do something, we'd say that you will have to look to whose responsibilities, as laid out by the Constitution, is most in line with the idea of eminent domain. And we think in this particular circumstance, that's clearly the president. And I'm very sorry for going over. I don't think they really responded to why we can't leave it to Congress. So cross-apply all of Jenny's earlier analysis, and we're very, very proud to propose.
I call upon the member of opposition to deliver the next constructive speech, not to exceed 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. I think what this round really boils down to is the question of whether the country can decide for itself whether it's in war or whether the president gets to decide whether it's in war. Because essentially what they're saying is that, look, the president has decided to send troops somewhere, Congress has decided to fund that troop incursion, therefore we're at war because the president has decided we're at war. Here's the problem with that. If the Congress agreed that we were in war, they would go ahead and say that we are in war. Why is this not redundant? Because of precisely the calculations that Michael tells you about. Because Congress is very cognizant of the fact that when they actually say officially that we're in war, rather than just funding troops, they expand a whole new realm of presidential powers. The realm of presidential powers that allows Eisenhower to act in precisely the manners that they're describing today. That's why there's cognizant choice to fund the war, yet not to declare war. Means that essentially Congress has said that we're willing to put money into this incursion because we think it merits that level of importance. But we don't think it's geopolitically important enough or rises to the level of national security importance such that we're willing to give the president the powers necessary to enact precisely the kinds of policies that you're talking about. What they're saying is that the president should just be able to unilaterally declare. This is why redundancy is not in fact the key, but instead the fact that Congress should be able to understand and strike these sorts of balances. Because we think on this side of the House that there's absolutely going to be conflicts that we're saying, yes, we should send some troops there. We have some strategic interests there, but the strategic interests don't rise to the level of saying that the president should have a blank check of war powers like the Constitution gives him, specifically in times that Congress has declared war. That's why this is not irrelevant. That's why that check is in the Constitution in the first place. And that's why we allow presidents to take actions that don't give them all sorts of powers. We think that this is important for another issue. Because recognize that there are going to be cases in the world where we want to send troops and fund those troops, but not give presidents a blank check for future actions. However, if you go with their side of the House, what's the precedent you're setting? You're setting the precedent that if Congress just decides to fund troops going to a foreign action area, going to a foreign arena of conflict, that means that in that decision alone, Congress has given the president the ability to open up any war powers he or she desires. What does that mean? It means that the United States particularly Congress, becomes much less likely to fund these sorts of incursions, even when they might be in our interest, because they take this other accountability check into account. We think that we give the Congress and the President much more flexibility to strike the nuanced balances that we need in order to have the best policies for national security while maintaining rights on our side of the House.
The Constitution says nothing about the President's ability to affect individual companies' ability to trade elsewhere. If the steel mills had decided to send all their steel to China, would you support the President going in and stopping that until Congress could make a law against it?
No. We think that if the President doesn't necessarily have the power to do that, then absolutely not. And in fact, we don't think that Congress necessarily has to be viewed as this absolute sole agency. If we think that it's going to be absolutely terrible that this is going to happen, Congress has held overnight sessions. They can get everyone in there right away. People can absolutely support these actions. The entire notion that Congress cannot be fast enough is a complete and bald assertion. We've seen historically that Congress can be exceedingly fast. Just think about the declaration of war during World War II. It happened the night before. We were in war the next day before the papers were printed. That's very quick action. We don't think that that's going to be any sort of problem. They need to justify that assertion. Moreover, they talk about the notion that, look, you have this ability to get discrimination law out of intertrade commerce. Why doesn't this mean that the President can just extrapolate powers? I think we already gave you a reason, because they say that you need some sort of implicit ability to have this power. They don't have any sort of implicit ability. The implicit abilities come from the war powers. That's why you can do things like shut down or take over a plant when you have war powers. That's the sort of implicitness of it. But when there's no power to begin with, then you can't have any implicit corollary or implicit derivative of that power. So that power needs to exist in the first place. Moreover, we think that their whole claim that, look, this whole idea of limited government, dude, that's just a theory, there's all sorts of other conceptions. It's really just a terrible, terrible argument. Why? Because first of all, we see that throughout the founding of the United States, it's not been the case. And I forget, I leaned over and asked Michael whether it's the 9th or 10th Amendment, but I forget which one, but one of them explicitly says, all powers not designated to the President and to the federal government are not powers of the federal government, but rather powers of the individual. At the point that we're not in war, and at the point that the Constitution explicitly tells us that the federal government is supposed to back off, and that's been the entire precedent of all Supreme Court history, we think that the Supreme Court should, hey, listen to the Constitution and listen to its own precedents on this matter. They've never given us any reason to believe otherwise. Next, they tell you the notion that Congress is funding it. Exactly. They're funding it and not declaring war. This is exactly the sort of balance that we want Congress to strike. Moreover, they talk about the fact that, look, you're not necessarily meeting your not necessary criteria because there's going to be a dent in steel. Look, they're really trying to be sneaky here in their rhetoric, because I took the history class on this. And there was, yes, the entire union was involved, but they were shutting down 5 plants out of the approximately 230 in the country, which means that even in the worst case scenario, there was going to be a lot of steel still available. The United States stockpiled steel in this era because they recognized it was a valuable military commodity. So it's not going to run away right away. And moreover, we think it's exceedingly important to recognize that your allies are going to be willing to give you steel. Yes, they're not going to have all the steel capacity, but they can probably replace 5 plants worth, right? There's probably 5 plants somewhere in Europe that can get you the steel, especially since they've agreed with your military policy in this case. Finally, they talk about the notion that, look, there needs to be restrictions on workers' rights. But they never really tell us why there should be restrictions. They only tell us that, well, people are going to get hurt. Isn't that the point of a strike? To hurt some people, to draw some attention to your cause? And moreover, they never grapple with the notion that, look, so some people walk out on the job, you can always hire more people to do the job. They don't understand how strikes work. Strikes work through solidarity. It's only when the vast majority of the public agrees with the workers' claims and agrees not to take their jobs and the company inevitably tries to replace them, that anything gets done. That relies on, first, some consumer pain to draw attention to their cause, and second, consumer agreement that that pain is warranted so that they actually don't go ahead and undermine their cause. Not going to give you the chance to justify that now. That misses the entire point of strike theory. Because if people actually don't agree with them, people are going to replace these jobs, and yes, you might lose a week's supply. You're stockpiling anyway. You're going to get all the steel back at this point. So it's only going to be effective if people agree. And if people do agree that this is unjust, that these people are getting these wages, absolutely. They should have the ability to enact some sort of change. I think that at the point that these steel companies are profit-making enterprises, they're going to have an incentive to slightly increase wages and still going to be able to go about their business. Then, we talk about the notion that, look, this is absolutely necessary for security. They talk about domino theory. Well, first of all, domino theory hasn't been invented yet. But I think that if you really want to, they really have to tell us why losing this particular peninsula is going to mean death and destruction for America. I'm going to give you a good reason why we don't think this is going to be the case. Why? Because Congress doesn't think it's going to be the case. Because if Congress did think it was as important, then they would have declared war, hence triggering all-out policies to win this all out. Instead, they just said, well, it's kind of important, we'd like to have it, but we're not willing to sacrifice all of our rights for it, and hence we think that's a strategic threat to the United States. They never tell us that the Congress should not be able to decide strategic threats to the United States, and unless they're going to use some sort of historical, post-looking back at the issue knowledge to say, oh, this was important. The fact is, at the time, people didn't think it was important. Respect that balance. Next, they talk about the notion that, look, the president is really the steward of the country. He needs to do whatever is necessary and proper. But here's the point, right? Necessary and proper. They haven't proven necessary, and they're clearly losing proper. And moreover, they nearly, completely missed the argument of the notion of precedent. Because notice that Congress is going to be very, very hesitant to give the president an inch in any time in the future. Because they know if they give up an inch, they're going to get taken for a whole yard by the president. And that's solely at the president's discretion. We think that at the point that you're defending the Constitution, the Supreme Court in no way should be advocating this sort of balance of powers, which is not at all the balance of powers that the framers intended, nor a balance of powers that is constructive to nuanced policymaking or protecting rights or strategic interests. Finally, they don't say anything else. So,
Here. I thank the member of opposition for his eloquent remarks. We call the leader of opposition to wrap up each speech for the opposition, aside for the opposition, the speech not to receive forward.
Thanks, 15.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, everyone. I think it's been a really interesting round. So there are two things to keep in mind when evaluating this round. The first is whether or not there is some sort of significant rights violation. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. And then there's a standard for when the president can engage in rights violations. And we're just going to use their rhetoric. Is it necessary and is it proper? And we're going to show that it's neither. They absolutely have to win both because that's what the Constitution, the law says. So they need to prove it's both necessary and proper. If we win either, we won the round. So first, does this significantly infringe on the rights of workers? I think we said very clearly, and I don't think they've effectively contested that the answer to this is yes. That they're doing this freely, democratically, within their rights to assemble, and within the rights given to workers' unions. We say that it's absolutely appropriate for them to strike if they think it will do anything successful. Anish gives you great analysis as to why, if it turns out the public doesn't support it, well, the workers are screwed and they've miscalculated, and then the steel will keep on flowing a week later. If the public does support it, though, what does that say? It's endemic of it's demonstrative of a problem within the steel industry and probably within industrial America in general. They never at all grappled with my analysis that the workers here represent really the proletariat, the worst off in society in a still very stratified America. The individuals that have the most difficulty putting food on their tables, feeding their families, and engaging in some, meaningful conception of the good American life. That's why these individuals are particularly vulnerable, and that's why it's particularly important that we preserve their rights. But what else don't they grapple with? The precedent that this sets for future potential strikes. Because if the standard is, so long as there's some unclear exigent circumstance that isn't specifically authorized to the president in which he can intervene, then workers who are striking can absolutely have the rug pulled out from under them by the executive at any point in time. I specifically say this could even shift over to domestic crises because there isn't a clear standard laid out. At that point, they have a chilling effect on strikes in the future. So even if you think this is the right decision in this particular instance, it sets a horrible precedent, undermining the ability of workers as a whole to engage in their free right to assemble and to strike. I think that shows a significant rights violation. They have a really high burden for showing that this is both necessary and proper at that point, because we recognize that if we're going to violate important rights, there must be a really important exigency to do so. So is this necessary? I think the clear answer to this is no. First and foremost, we say that you can get the steel elsewhere, first from the mills that aren't closed. But I don't even think we need to win that empirical debate about assertions. The point where I say that yes, the Allies, they may not be fully rebuilt, but they're certainly much more rebuilt than they were in 1945. And the point where your allies are fighting with you and will give you low prices on steel. I even specifically say they have every incentive because you're the one funding the troops to produce as much steel at as low a price as possible for you. We can get the steel. If they haven't contested that we can get the steel, then on face this isn't necessary. But I think I also haven't done a good job in contesting that the war isn't winnable. I tell you in my LOC that you have tons of troops over there. This is 1952, right near the time of MacArthur's offensive. They've never shown that steel is necessary to win this war. If they haven't shown that it's necessary to win the war, even if you buy that the war is necessary for national security, we can still win it on our side of the house. Lastly, is it necessary for national security? I think we've given you great analysis as to no. First of all, domino theory came up in the next big conflict, but also we tell you, and they don't respond to the fact, that China and the Soviet Union haven't been involved in the Korean War at this point, and that there's no reason to believe that the Korean War is going to be an attempt for China or the Soviet Union to power grab. At that point, we recognize that they're the major threats to US national security. I think it's very clear that this isn't so important that we need to limit the rights of this very important contingent of society. Final question then, is this proper? Answer is very clearly no. So, I want to make right now what I think is a really clear distinction between the discrimination powers of the Congress and the war powers of the President. Now, we tell you that the ability to regulate discrimination in the workplace is implied within the notion of regulating commerce. They said, well, the ability to regulate rights domestically is implied within the war powers of the President. But what do we say? That the Constitution explicitly has an activating mechanism for those implicit powers to trigger down. That's why Congress included the ability to declare war. I rise on a point of information. I say, why would that power be given in the Constitution if the President could always declare, or effectively declare war and send troops wherever he wanted, and get to limit all the rights that he wants? I don't think they give a good answer. I think they need to give a good answer to that to win that point in PMR. This sets a terrible precedent for the future and makes it unclear when the President can commit to war and will make Congress much more likely to fund necessary measures in the future. This is the best balance. It's the most just balance. We beg to oppose 440.
Opposition, we call the Prime Minister to deliver the final speech of the panel, who received 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys, this has been a great round. I have a couple things I'd like to say about the last two speeches really quickly, then I'm going to get into 2 points, the second one almost being 3 points, but let's just call it 2. All right, so first of all, they talk about, in the very end of the last speech, they talk about how there's an explicit mechanism in the Constitution that grants the President different powers during a time of war. Okay, we've said this many times throughout the round, and we'll say it again, this is just not true. The presidential powers are outlined in Article 2. They do not change whether or not war is declared or not. This is just how it is. Oftentimes, in practical matters, the President is given slightly more leeway during a time of war. However, there is no explicit mechanism in the Constitution, and their assertions here just don't add anything. Moreover, in terms of the balance of power that they've been asserting, we think the balance of power here is the President is the Commander-in-Chief. Congress holds the purse strings. In this situation, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of all these troops, whom Congress has said, yes, you can send them over there, we'll give you all the money. So effectively, this is the same thing. They keep saying the war has not been declared, but not only does this not affect the President's powers, but declaring war is, in practical terms, like a diplomatic, I don't know, message to like how we feel about that country. Actually, if we're in a military engagement. Okay, well I'm responding to new points in the ammo, so I hope you'll take that into consideration. But anyway, moving on to what they've been talking about again. They say only 5 plants have been shut down. This was a new point that was brought up recently. Again, this doesn't matter. We were already under production before we even went into the war. Any dent is going to have a catastrophic effect on the war effort. And moreover, okay, yeah, and so they talk a lot about rights violation, and I think I'm going to get into that, but one more rebuttal that I have to the new points that they brought up is this idea that, you know, the primacy of the workers' rights, and you should never ever stop the workers from striking. But again, you can't just strike whenever, and you can't just do whatever you want if it's going to interfere with a military operation. This is a clear and present danger, basically. You can't just do whatever you want if whatever you want is telling military secrets to the enemy. You can't just do whatever you want if you're going to significantly cripple a military operation. Anyway, so getting into my points of crystallization. The first one is about the broader situation. I've dealt with this a little bit, but I'm going to go into more depth. Basically, this idea of war versus military engagement. Again, declaring war doesn't affect the constitutional powers and the presidential powers in the Constitution, and these presidential powers are broad for a very specific reason, and that is the fact that the framers knew that situations were going to arise, crises were going to arise, they could not explicitly provide for it. This is why they made things broad, and this is why, as Commander-in-Chief, they didn't place limitations on the President's actions. That's why we think that this was justified under this circumstance. Moreover, again, they assert that there's a difference between war powers and other powers. No. Moreover, they talk a lot about how you shouldn't give a blank check to the President during war. No, you should not give a blank check. I don't see how at any point we've asserted that the President seizing the steel mills is giving him a blank check. I think Meg dealt with this pretty well, but again, like, Congress has been funding the war, and moreover, when he's doing this, not only is he attempting to carry out his Commander-in-Chief powers, but he's upholding congressional laws and things that Congress told him to do. Namely, strengthen national defenses and make sure that prices are stabilized. Because So getting on to my second point. This is about sort of a balance of harms, national security on the one hand, the workers' rights on the other hand, and the presidential role in this situation. And I think this is where it's going to show that it was both necessary and proper as he framed it. So first of all, you have the military situation, and this is where the necessary part comes in, the national security risk. They assert a lot of things about how the Korean War didn't matter at all, as if we were just bunking around over there shooting people for no reason. And we think this is like patently untrue. I think that we both talked about this. But again, like as we said, this is the Cold War. Obviously, when you're in the Cold War situation, if you just say, oh, we can't even win the little Korean peninsula, this is going to have like a significant harm, what you said.
Point of order, the notion that this is sending, like if you lose here, that sends a message of weakness is a new argument.
Okay. If you,
Under consideration.
yeah, I think that we've talked about the necessity of the war before, and we've mentioned the Cold War, and this was dealt with by many. But again, and also a new point in the MO that was brought up, I'll respond quickly. He says that because domino theory wasn't invented till later, that you can't apply it to the situation before. That's not how theories work. You can apply them to things that happened before the theory was invented. So yeah, Korea was important, and moreover, the importance of steel was significant. We already contested them on this point. They said we didn't. But again, they say, well, why don't you just get steel from somewhere else? And I think that we already said, like, Europe is still rehabilitating itself. We don't have enough steel. Like, we need all the steel we can get for a variety of reasons. And that leads me to my second point under this, is the economic situation. And again, not only is the president enforcing Congress's law, but when you're talking about workers' rights and how this is going to hurt the workers, if you realize that if you stop producing steel, prices are going to rise drastically. This is probably going to hurt the workers more than whatever raise they were going to get. So like this isn't going to help the workers as they assert that it's going to. Moreover, they talk a lot about how I think we've dealt with fairly well that because the workers' right isn't completely a blank check in their terms under any situation, we don't think that in a balance of harms that national security should be compromised to this degree just because the steel workers can't get their act together in 6 months, especially when this is sort of a holding pattern until Congress can get their act together. So for all these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you.